Video games are a young and compelling medium. Across the last 40 years or so, they've become an entertainment mainstay. Games are now referenced without cringe in pop culture. Games are legitimate CV edition for actors and directors and artists and, yes, writers. Games, once taken from other forms of media, are now bleeding into popular entertainment through both direct adaptation and indirect influence. And above all else, video games have been providing yet another avenue for people to create stories. Stories that are unlike anything other forms of media can produce. This is going to be a broad subject and by no means exhaustive, so let's get the context out of the way. I was born in 1994, the year of the PlayStation's release. I've lived through a time when video games went from inconsequential fluff for kids to play after school to pop culture icons that continue to inspire admiration across demographics. They now form a significant portion of the entertainment industry and show some of the most creative feats in art, world and narrative design. And that's what this video is about, narratives. Because over the past 6 months, I've been coming to a reconciliation with the truth that just a few years ago I'd have been embarrassed to admit. Out of all the stories, plots, and characters I've absorbed across different forms of media, most of the ones that really stuck and inspired me as a writer have come from video games. There is a relatively good reason why storytelling was, for a long time, not seen as important when applied to video games, with some obvious exceptions. Even in the 2000s to 2010s, there was a dominant feeling that video games were for children, even though before I was born there were multiple titles that bucked that trend. It's part of the reason why titles like Mortal Kombat and Grand Theft Auto 3 were so controversial, because they were explicitly aimed at older audiences. A bit like when books started dealing with taboo topics like realistic murder or nationalism or unhealthy attraction, or when movie theatres would readily play host to both light and happy musicals and grim high-concept thrillers. Today video games have mostly shaken off that stigma, as my generation and the one before have become a dominant force in the market. We grew up with video games and don't see them as inconsequential fluff any more than people from the generations before saw pieces of great literature or classic films as such. That generation's still around and still shouting very loudly, but they're not the de facto market force anymore. There are also unique issues with availability and corporate messing about related to video games, but this isn't touching on those. Instead, this is a video that will look at stories. When video games started using them, how they were used, what they borrowed from other forms of media, and how video games have unique constraints and advantages that many creators have used to their advantage. Before I move on, I want to give a shout out to Cam Wing's video, Cinematic Games and Their Very Weird Storytelling. It covers some of the same ground as this one, but it mostly focuses on, well, it's in the title. And he makes the distinction between story and plot. They can be a sound story, but a weak plot, or vice versa. It makes sense in context. Because I kind of agree with his perspective on this point, I'll be using the term narrative in this video to encompass both story and plot. And I must clarify that my discussions on narrative in games have nothing to do with quality. Some really cinematic pieces have horrible narratives, and vice versa. When we think about early classic games, we don't remember their narratives. Mario didn't need a narrative, Pac-Man didn't need a narrative, Pong didn't need a narrative. All the former two have is premises, which aren't the same thing. These titles, originating in the arcades, sold due to their entertaining gameplay and visuals. That continued for some little time, and while some series born during this period have broken away from that and forged strong narrative atmospheres if nothing else, many still carry that legacy of gameplay first. The origins of those titles not being made with narratives in mind shows even to this day. Mario may have some moments that stick, but the overarching narratives are just an excuse. Most fighting game series that have incorporated narrative after the fact into what was originally a contest of cool character designs have struggled a lot with putting flesh and skin on this initial skeleton. The absolute mess of lore and reboots and more reboots that is Mortal Kombat is evidence of that. I don't think this counts as a rule, but more a commonality of series that emerged during the 80s into early 90s. After that point, narratives were present to a greater degree, even if it was just text windows and occasional CGI cutscenes. Think Dead or Alive or Soul Calibur or Metroid. But in general, as the technology improved, storage space increased, and developers had active ambitions to challenge other mediums in terms of experiences with music, art and characters, the norm slowly shifted. Stories began to appear, and moreover they began to become important. By the 1990s, memorable if not always grand stories were popping up across multiple game genres: Final Fantasy, Resident Evil, Tomb Raider, most of LucasArts, and the products of 101 smaller indie studios. So what would be the best two summations of these contrasting ends of the narrative importance spectrum? One of the most notorious comments on the superfluity of narratives in games came in 2003 from John Carmack, a key developer in the seminal Wolfenstein, Doom and Quake series. These franchises helped push gaming into the mainstream, but Carmack is quoted as saying that game stories are like a story in a movie, aka it's there, but it's not what you're there for. He has become less hardline about the point, but still feels gameplay should be a priority. And there is some validity to his point, since video games are, in the name, as a rule, reliant on some form of gameplay. When you get more narrative than gameplay in this space, you get into some interesting territory with more weasel words than you might expect. A different take on the importance of narrative comes from Hironobu Sakaguchi, creator of the Final Fantasy franchise. For the first 3 Final Fantasy titles, Sakaguchi thought very little about narrative, but following the tragic death of his mother Aki, Sakaguchi re-evaluated his approach to storytelling, with Final Fantasy IV, the first game after his mother's death, having a much greater focus on a dramatic and thematic narrative. Much of his work afterwards has continued to revolve around character-driven narrative, and since his departure from Square Enix, the Final Fantasy franchise has generally placed great emphasis on its narrative and characters, sometimes to its detriment, as in Final Fantasy XIII, which prioritised a cinematic approach at the expense of player freedom. These contrasting approaches set up a superficial dichotomy that was present for much of my early life and in the years before I was born. If you wanted narratives with involved, deep or in-your-face elements, then you looked to offerings from Japan. If you wanted more gameplay-focused titles, you went to North America. Europe tended to be something of a piggy-in-the-middle roll-of-the-dice area for gaming narrative prominence, and still is. Now, this isn't by any means a universal rule. There are plenty of exceptions that undermine this rule in quotes. We'll get into some of those exceptions later on, but we have more ground to cover. A major irony about how little narrative mattered in early games was that narrative was something of a cornerstone for its predecessors, tabletop games and live role-playing games, or LARPs.
Oh, yes, we're very holy.
And yes, it is. It's been quite a while. I'm rather hungry.
We all
again.
sleep together. It's a polyamorous thing.
I told you we were holy.
Hammond and Vex make deception checks, please.
Perception?
Deception.
Deception. Oh.
21.
Oh.
While the narrative tends not to be strictly dictated in those mediums, there are still narratives being created, and an overall premise being followed. Any session of Dungeons & Dragons or its equivalents should tell you that much. But they also offer infinitely more freedom even within set worlds. The types of narratives one may find seem often to be dictated by genre, and in the case of gaming, genre is a tricky thing when it comes to narratives. Just think about the definition of genre. A kind or style, especially of art or literature, e.g. tragedy, drama, satire. A book may be classified as satire, modernist, literary. A film or television project can be called drama, comedy, thriller, musical. Whole swaths of media are pigeonholed into science fiction, fantasy, crime, romance. But game genres are defined by their gameplay styles more than their narrative tones. They describe their mechanics rather than their narrative content. Drawing from the library of one company, Platinum Games, we have Star Fox Zero, Nier Automata, and Astral Chain. While all are in the science fiction narrative genre, they are principally described with their game genres, rail shooter, action role-playing and action adventure respectively. Similarly, the majority of Square Enix's current and archive library falls into the role-playing genre, but in terms of narrative they're all over the place. While game genre isn't necessarily tied directly to narrative genre, it can dictate the type and tone of one. Role-playing games tend towards longer-form dramatic narratives. Action or action-adventure titles often use snappier, character-focused storylines with high individual stakes. Survival horror has it in the name. And rail shooters, well, they often have stories, but it's not usually the most substantial, more of a backdrop. Again, obviously, there can be and are exceptions. Few would call the narratives of Panzer Dragoon insubstantial, and the Bayonetta series, especially Bayonetta 3, isn't winning any awards for its narrative. The game's genre can also dictate narrative pacing. Open worlds typically have fairly low-stress narratives that will wait for the player, while more structured or time-sensitive titles can and will pace things more rigorously. We have further distinction between plot-driven titles, a la The Legend of Zelda, Sphinx and the Cursed Mummy, and Monster Hunter, and character-driven titles, which covers most RPGs. These similarly have different impacts on narrative, ranging from minor alterations to how some characters are portrayed, to major implications over how the story is communicated. Games, like artistic movies or paintings, can get away with having thematically impactful content without there being an explicit narrative told with actions and dialogue. Because gameplay. Probably the most popular among non-narrative setting-driven stories are From Software's projects that hit the mainstream with Demon's Souls in 2009 and have extended through Dark Souls, Bloodborne and Elden Ring. It's an approach summed up by essayist Dan Olson as no meaning, only lore. The narrative is more about the player's interaction with pre-established pieces of lore told through sparse and cryptic dialogue or description. It's an approach I personally find reductive, but it demonstrably has an audience. Several other titles have taken this aesthetics and mechanics first approach, while still having narrative elements to follow. The work of Jeppe Carlsen on Limbo, Inside and Cocoon demonstrates this philosophy, placing focus on their puzzle-based designs while telling a narrative through their environments. Fumito Ueda's haunting landscapes are held together with understandable yet thematically heavy narrative content and context. Genova Chen's titles from That Game Company and Matt Nava's successor titles at Giant Squid rely a lot on implicit narrative over explicit narration or exposition. An interesting creator to highlight in this area is Tetsuya Mizuguchi. His music games, which he described as intending to produce a feeling of synesthesia, don't tend to have the kind of traditional narratives that you find elsewhere. The Space Channel 5 series is a string of musical set pieces to Simon Says style gameplay, while Rez and Child of Eden are more like interactive concerts. There is some narrative theming in Rez especially, with a poem being created for its final level and an opening premise of an AI shutting down due to a crisis of conscience. But you don't need to know that to get into its Eurodisco accompanied shooting sections. At the other end of the sliding scale of narrative in games is the likes of Naughty Dog and Hideo Kojima. Their work is aggressively narrative driven, with Kojima in particular going in for extremely long cutscenes and prolonged dialogue sequences. I will say, regardless of his skill, Kojima has a problem in this regard. Since Metal Gear Solid 2, his narratives have become increasingly long-winded and in dire need of an editor to keep cutscene and dialogue length in check. Meanwhile, Naughty Dog is a little difficult to assess, as some parts of the information surrounding them has become muddled with who contributed how much of what to certain titles. But the Uncharted series, Misery Simulator aka The Last of Us, and even Jak and Daxter were all very narrative focused. Uncharted especially, which at times seemed to edge into the territory of an interactive movie, especially when you watch the cutscenes and in-game dialogue in isolation. Mentioning interactive movies brings us to a very particular style of video game narrative. Games where narrative is given priority over literally everything else. These are almost always found in the adventure genre and its derivatives, visual novels from Japan from companies like Key and Automate, or the graphic or limited gameplay adventures from Quantic Dream, Supermassive and Telltale. Titles from these companies are often so lacking in gameplay that they might as well qualify as interactive movies. In an outlying case, Capcom's beat-em-up Azura's Wrath was deliberately designed to be less of a game and more of an interactive anime series with an OVA-like true ending released as DLC. And of course, from interactive movies, we reach gaming's incorporation into the modern multimedia space. Whether as straight adaptations, additional narratives, or just tie-ins without any explicit connection, video games have become the vehicles for other narrative mediums since their inception. There's the obvious punching bag of licensed games, and if you want more on that, check out Austin's Eruption's many videos on the topic. Sometimes, as in Parasite Eve, Megami Tensei, or The Witcher, games have acted as semi-official continuation for other narratives. These narratives can be, and often are, good, but there remains that stigma, because for the longest time, video game narratives weren't created by professional authors or known scriptwriters. For much of the industry's life, many notable video game narratives were created by people from within the industry. Programmers, designers, artists, directors, even composers. That's not to detract from their writing skill, absolutely not. Yasumi Matsuno, Amy Hennig, Hiroki Kikuta, Jane Jensen, Tim Schafer, Riko Suzuki, George Kamitani, all of these people created compelling narratives to match or even surpass other media of their day. But because of that distinction, there was a reflexive snobbishness from the mainstream. The likes of, sure, so-and-so wrote this incredible and moving story, but they're not insert marketable name here who wrote this book or scripted this film that made $10 gazillion. No, I'm not sorry for the silly accent. And even when famous names did become involved in games, the result was almost always not great. If you look up the games that saw involvement from Steven Spielberg, Clive Barker, Kinji Fukasaku, Orson Scott Card, and Guillermo del Toro, you'll find that for a variety of reasons they were either commercial flops or failed to launch. There is a further caveat to put in here, because this separation and almost segregation that existed between media types for a time may be common in the West, but in the East, not so much. There is a common tradition in that area of having companies set up explicitly for the creation of narratives. Groups like Stella Vista, Edgeworks, Gecko, and Algebra Factory exist to create narratives for movies, anime, and of course video games. It's a pattern that's not common in the West, although you will definitely find examples. It's a product of a different media landscape with different expectations. And that, I think, brings us to the crux of this video. Most of the examples up to now have been titles which rely fairly heavily on ground trodden by other forms of media. Some creators, like Kojima, Hennig, and Matsuno, have either compared or had their work compared to classic pieces of film, television, and literature. Even if they exploit game mechanics, they still tie back to traditional forms of narrative structure. Yet video games have a unique attribute that gives them the chance to tell narratives none of these others can do: interactivity. While naturally constrained by technical limitations and the need to craft narratives to some degree, several of the most memorable narratives in gaming are so because they do things other pieces of media can't. Think of the original Fate Stay Night or Fire Emblem Three Houses, titles that told multiple related yet distinct and equally detailed narratives based on a route that the player chose. If one tried turning them into other forms of narrative, the task would be overwhelming. In one case, it almost is. This is on the highly scripted end of the spectrum. There are also the emergent narratives one might find between players and teams through multiplayer-focused titles. Another is narratives that directly reference the player partaking in the game or the mechanics driving it. Yet another is the famous emergent and player-driven style of the immersive sim, pioneered by titles like System Shock and Deus Ex. Many aspects of these approaches tie back to the issue of game genre dictating the kind of narrative that appears. Two fascinating examples of game-specific narrative invention that take full advantage of genre rather than being bowed by it can be found in Kotaro Uchikoshi's Zero Escape series. A key twist is cleverly concealed within the third-person overarching narration of 999, while in Virtue's Last Reward, a similar yet distinct twist is hidden behind its first-person perspective. Uchikoshi in general uses game mechanics to enhance his narratives, using 3 different ones in each of his Somnium File titles. All of Uchikoshi's titles rely on some level of breaking player immersion for dramatic effect, either through subverting their expectations or breaking the fourth wall. His work can be contrasted against Danganronpa, a series from a similar yet distinct creator, Kazutaka Kodaka, that blends a strictly scripted narrative with gameplay in a variety of ways. It often takes direct shots at the fourth wall and makes some pretty meta comments on media in general, especially in the second and third titles Goodbye Despair and Killing Harmony. One of the most recent titles to embrace gaming's narrative potential is the 100-line Last Defense Academy, which was co-created by Kodaka and Ujikoshi. The title isn't just for show. One of its marketed appeals is the narrative's 100 endings. If this were attempted in any other medium, the project would snap under its own weight. This is a narrative with 100 different possible story parts, many with wildly different events and outcomes. In one route you're discovering the secrets behind your role, in another it's a situational comedy, in another again it's a survival game against a serial killer. And from that we come to a mainstay of many games today: multiple endings. My first real encounter with this was with Yoko Taro's Drakengard and Nier series, which used multiple endings unlocked sequentially to explore different aspects of each entry's narrative, or deconstruct the player's actions up to that point. Some titles also hold a false ending, like World of Final Fantasy or multiple Megami Tensei titles, with the player directly asked a question like, "Are you sure about this outcome?" directly involving them in events. Not all multiple endings are this in-depth, often coming down to a percentage check of how much you've done, or coming down to narrative choices made up to that point. Or they can be more dictated by how you interact with companion characters, be they people who fight alongside you, or an adorable dog. BioWare titles are probably the big popular example of this approach. For one of my more recent favourite examples, we have Baldur's Gate 3, which has several broad narrative branches and dozens of smaller variations depending on whom you romance, what character archetype you are, or whom you side with. It's just a massive tangle of choices that, combined with dice rolls, mean it's borderline impossible to get the same experience twice in a row. My two ending choices and the paths I took had so many incremental personal or tonal differences between them, they might as well have been different titles in the same world. One, a shining and comedic path of redemption with a sweet gay romance. The other, a walking disaster that ended things on a decidedly darker overall tone. Of course, video game narratives aren't free from valid criticism. Due to their nature as being often divided into levels or driven by objectives like kill this entity or collect X number of MacGuffins, their storytelling becomes quite modular. This is especially true for more plot-driven narratives, which tend to strongly echo the archaic go from A to B storytelling style of Krull or Conan or Red Sonja over anything more innovative. There was also the fact that the presentation of narratives could get pretty ropey, similar to how voice acting and animation was for a pretty long time. Due to most of its presentation until recently not being based on motion capture with the actual actors saying their lines, there was some inherent disconnect. Bad voice acting isn't unique to video games, but gaming has provided some choice examples to chew on. Resident Evil and Legend of Dragoon spring to mind, both of which also ran into further issues with localization and translation, which is a whole other kettle of fish that I might address someday, I don't know. And that's without getting into the eternal quandary of content needing to be cut or reworked, which in video games can be a lot more obvious due to data mining or previews or even leaked builds. And I guess we can't talk about video game narrative issues without mentioning that one term which appeared in the mid-2000s to describe a particular part of how stories and gameplay interact: ludonarrative dissonance. This is a dense area with enough research depth and content, it's a surprise it hasn't undergone gravitational collapse. The term was first coined by Clint Hoking on his personal blog in 2007, and has since become something of a catch-all term for when a game's mechanics don't mesh with its narrative. Hoking's original example was BioShock, which to him implicitly encouraged a selfish and grasping gameplay style and objective-based goals, but had a story about being able to show self-sacrificing traits and rebelling against an assigned role. Others have taken up the cry and highlighted several series that don't have gameplay and story meshing together neatly. Mass Effect, Uncharted, Call of Duty, the list goes on and on. A bit of context here is that Hoking was at the time working on Far Cry 2, a game with few traditional cutscenes and a narrative where you're a monster no matter what you try and do to mitigate that. Fitting for a mercenary in an African nation torn by civil war. The term ludonarrative, a portmanteau of the Latin ludo meaning game and narrative, has sadly become a catch-all to the point that its original meaning is getting a little murky, as with any catchy term. Are you using it to describe an actual disconnect between story and gameplay? Is it a term you heard and think sounded cool? Or is it a means by which to denigrate a game that wasn't designed with thematic harmony in mind? I think there is the argument to make that ludonarrative dissonance can be a deliberate choice, conscious or not, to drive home a game's themes. Walt Williams, a co-writer for Spec Ops: The Line, highlighted the in-game dissonance to show the protagonist as a flawed hypocrite. From my experience, Drakengard and Nier again spring to mind. They are united by a theme of questioning why people commit acts of violence, taking a pretty negative stance by their endings, but they're still full of violence and in the case of Nier Automata, pretty fun to play. There is a counterpoint to Hoking's dissonance that has seen far less use as a buzzword, and that is ludonarrative consistency, also called ludonarrative harmony. Again, research on this was tricky, but more because while dissonance brings in the clicks, consistency or harmony don't. It's only in the last few years that serious academic attention was given to this contrasting concept compared to the many think pieces on ludonarrative dissonance and how it's totally ruining every game story ever. You'll be hard pressed to find articles talking about it in relation to different games, at least using a specific term, mainly because ludonarrative consistency / harmony is when a game's doing its job, so you don't notice. Personally, I would consider the gameplay and narratives of both Uchikoshi's titles and Gust's Atelier series to have great ludonarrative harmony. Both groups revolve around progression according to a set task, with the best / true endings coming from either discovering the full truth or exploring all that a world and task has to offer. So, was there a point to this essay? Well, I suppose there was, otherwise I'd probably have scrapped it 4,000 words ago. My point is that video game narratives have unique potential, as well as being able to match other forms of media in presentation and having their own unique drawbacks. It means that the old conceit that video game narratives aren't good just because they're in video game form no longer has legs to stand on. They're subject to the same issues of quality as any other narrative. Just as there are terrible books and films and television series, there are terrible game narratives. And just as there are films which define culture, books that move hearts, television series that keep one hooked week after week, there are games which you absolutely must complete to see the ending. Not because of the gameplay, but because of a narrative that has captured your heart. Thank you for watching. If you want to check out more of my content, you may like the video where I explain the myth and usage of Square Enix's ill-fated Fabula Nova Crystallis project. I also have a podcast which has stories and story discussion, and some other stuff I do for fun. If you want to support me, links to my latest book are in the description. So until next time, see ya!